Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. With an increasing number of UK adults in vulnerable circumstances as a result of the pandemic, the FCA has now issued its finalised guidance to ensure the fair treatment of vulnerable customers, and this topic remains high on their agenda moving forward. I'm delighted today to introduce Jan Holt, our Specialist Business Development Manager, who will spend the next 30 minutes or so sharing her knowledge around this important topic. I'm Alexis Ward, Intermediary Distribution Manager here at Scottish Widows, and I'll be your host for the next 45 minutes. Please do use the Q&A box on your screen to submit your questions at any point during the presentation. And please note that all questions are submitted anonymously, so we will keep a lookout for the same key themes that we can answer towards the end of the session. This webinar is being recorded, and we will share on demand the link with everyone who is registered for this session. This will come through tomorrow. Today's event forms part of our expert series where we take on some of the key issues in our industry to help you navigate the changing market. We have been building this content for the last 9 months and are currently preparing a podcast on our claim statistics and a webinar next month on the lifetime allowance rules. So please look out for links to these in future emails. Our learning outcomes today are as follows. We want you to be able to consider how you might identify vulnerability within your client base, outline the potential consequences for those in vulnerable situations, identify what you can do to best support those in vulnerable situations. I don't want to waste any more of your time, so let's get started. Jan, it's over to you.
Thank you, Alexis, and good morning, everybody. Well, the FCA has been looking closely at vulnerability since 2015, and as Alexis says, we now have that final guidance, FG 21.1, which was published in February this year. So it's quite timely that we're speaking today, because what I want to do is summarise what it is they expect of us, and also want to share our thoughts on some of the tools and techniques that you can use to bring this guidance to life within your business. But before we do that, let's take our first poll of this morning, and I'd like to ask you to think about your business. And please tell us what percentage of your clients you either think or know would be classed as vulnerable. So hopefully you can see a survey on your screen, and if you have a look at the options there, tell us what you think, and then click the red submit button to give us your response. And then while you're thinking about that, I've just put a slide up here to remind ourselves of how the FCA actually defines vulnerability. So as you'll see, there is a risk that those who are in vulnerable circumstances are more susceptible to harm. And we're going to take a closer look at what that means shortly. But before we do that, let's have a look at your thoughts and the poll results. Okay, so I can see here that and this is fairly similar to a poll that we ran in June 2020, where, just over a majority of people on this particular poll believe that fewer than 1 in 5 of their clients are actually classed as vulnerable. And then, as we see at the opposite end of the spectrum, then very few of you think that you've got very high percentages of clients who are vulnerable. So just to put some context around this, the Financial Lives Coronavirus Survey, which was carried out for the FCA in October 2020, showed that more people are finding themselves in vulnerable circumstances due to the pandemic. And that particular study assessed there to be 53% of adults in the UK who are displaying at least one characteristic of vulnerability. So that's 27.7 million people, and that was an increase of over 3 million since February 2020. So you can see that while protecting the vulnerable has always been a key focus for the FCA, they actually do see this as more important than ever, specifically as a result of the pandemic. And in essence, they want those who find themselves in a vulnerable situation to experience outcomes as good as those for other customers. And the guidance is designed to help us understand how we treat vulnerable customers fairly. It's also worth mentioning that in the FCA's supervisory activity, they're going to be asking firms how their business model, their actions that they take, and their culture demonstrate that they're doing this. So the new guidance is built around key expectations in relation to vulnerability. So let's have a look at those. First of all, the FCA expects firms to understand the needs of those who are vulnerable. So that means knowing what the drivers and consequences of vulnerability might be and considering the type of harm that people may be vulnerable to. Then they want to see everybody within businesses understanding their role in treating vulnerable customers fairly and also having the knowledge, the skills and the confidence to work effectively with them. They then want us to respond to the needs of the vulnerable in the way that we design products, in the way that we interact with customers through offering flexible service and clear communications. And then finally, they expect that all of this is going to be monitored and evaluated on an ongoing basis with improvements made where they're needed. And these key expectations can actually be downloaded from the FCA website as a one-page document. And I think that makes a great starting point for anybody out there who's actually reviewing or designing their approach. The next step, of course, would be to distill the guidance document in its entirety down to the parts that you believe are relevant for your business. And for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to pick out some of those or highlight some of those relevant areas. And we're going to start by thinking about identifying those who are vulnerable. Now, this isn't always necessarily straightforward because vulnerability comes in such a huge range of guises. And of course, many people who are in a vulnerable situation wouldn't necessarily recognize themselves as such. However, there are certain risk factors that can be particularly important within financial services. And so it can be helpful to think about key drivers of vulnerability. And the FCA has actually summarized the various situations that might make us vulnerable into 4 key categories. First of all, the health conditions, physical or mental illnesses that affect our ability to carry out day-to-day tasks, and that, of course, would include managing finances. There are major life events that can make it difficult to cope emotionally and can also trigger a financial loss. And it was interesting, I think, that the FCA has now added retirement right at the top of this list. So I think what that means is that for those of you who operate a centralised retirement proposition, then you need to have consideration of vulnerability embedded into that. There are things that will result in low financial resilience and a range of situations that would result in poor financial capability. And of course here there could be a link back to some of the life events. And many advisors I speak to will tell me that in the case of divorce or bereavement, for example, clients can find themselves in a position where they're having to deal with things or make decisions that they've never been involved with before. So this particular page, I think, can be helpful as a little aid memoir, I guess, to look out for the indicators that you might be working with a vulnerable client. But it is worth considering the common drivers of vulnerability that are most likely to present in your firm's target market or client base. So, for example, those of you who may be advised mostly on investments and pensions will be tending to work with older clients. And so the frequently seen characteristics of vulnerability may involve health and life events associated with aging. Firms who are working with younger clients, maybe those who are advising on mortgages and protection, for example, could find that their client base is more likely to be experiencing a lack of financial resilience, such as inadequate or erratic income, particularly in the current climate. And then some characteristics like bereavement and relationship breakdown, I guess, will be present across all firms. But what's often commented when looking at these indicators is that most of us are vulnerable or will be at some point in our lifetimes. And that's probably true, but as this slide shows, we all fall somewhere on this spectrum of vulnerability. So those to the left of the spectrum are less likely to be vulnerable and therefore face a lower risk of harm than those on the right-hand side of the spectrum, where that risk of harm is much more acute. It's more likely that those on the right-hand side are going to have different or additional needs to those on the left, and particularly where there's more than one characteristic of vulnerability. But we need to respond to the needs of all clients along this spectrum. Now, you may challenge me that you do this already. You treat all customers fairly, as indeed you are obligated to. So how I tend to think about the approach to vulnerability is like TCF plus. So, for example, if a client of yours loses their job or has been bereaved, then they are more likely to have different or additional support needs to some of your other clients. And if those needs aren't met, they may be susceptible to harm. So simply by adding an extra layer of service or support where it's needed, or TCF plus as I called it, we can minimize that risk. So how do you go about spotting the signs of vulnerability? So here are some of the main things to be alert to. And starting from the left of this table, then it could be something that you see during a client meeting or something that you hear in a meeting or a call. And I guess the points in the first two columns here relate to anything that indicates to you that there's been a change in your client's behavior, understanding, or health. Moving on to the third column, it may be that the transactions your client wants to engage in would cause you to consider whether they may now be vulnerable. And on the final column, there's a list of things, changes in circumstance that a client may directly disclose to you. So if you have a client who's displaying one or more of the characteristics on this page or the earlier slide we looked at, then that's a flag for you to put your vulnerable client process to work to establish whether vulnerability exists. And if it does, what does that mean for your client and how can you best support them? So I'm interested to know whether you've seen more evidence of these characteristics or signs of vulnerability in the last 12 months. So we're going to have our second poll, and I'd like you to vote to let us know about your experience here. So in the last 12 months, has the number of clients that you believe to be vulnerable increased as a direct result of the COVID-19 pandemic? Has it increased because you've broadened the scope of who you're classifying as vulnerable? Or has it increased because of both of those two options? Has it stayed the same, or in your view, has it actually decreased? And while you're thinking about that question, just a quick reminder that you can submit questions in the Q&A section at any time during this presentation, and we'll be aiming to answer those at the end of the session. So I'll just give you a few more moments to think about our second poll. Okay, let's have a look at the results of this one. Yeah, so that's interesting, and I guess as I might have expected, a majority of you have seen an increase in the number of clients you believe is vulnerable, and that is in part because of COVID, but also because you've taken a broader view of who you classify as vulnerable. Now, as we've seen, the regulator's own findings have highlighted quite a staggering number of people, I think, who are considered as vulnerable. And that actually went up 15% between February and October 2020. Now, given the ongoing impact of the coronavirus pandemic, that number is likely to keep going up. So the message here, I guess, is that it's important for us to be continually reviewing where our clients sit on that spectrum of vulnerability that we looked at a few moments ago. And of course, we need to explore how vulnerability might then lead our clients towards harm. And to do that, let's first think about the possible consequences of being in a vulnerable situation. Now, of course, different clients will act in different ways, but here are just some thoughts about this. So we know that many vulnerable clients face real barriers in understanding and acting on information. And there's also research from the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute suggesting that 75% of people with mental health problems will have serious difficulty engaging with at least one commonly used communication channel. So in other words, they will really dislike being on the phone. That might make them very stressed or anxious. They will not log in and look at emails, or they'll let the post pile up because they struggle to open letters. And of course, the same may be true for clients in other vulnerable circumstances. They may have some quite specific communication challenges and needs. So a combination of reduced understanding and communication issues, when overlaid with common behavioural biases, can really impact a client's decision-making process. They may experience heightened stress levels, they may be preoccupied and have reduced processing power, or they may even have a changing attitude toward taking risk. And of course, the financial impact of making poor decisions can really have quite long-term effects. So in other words, their situation can expose them to the risk of experiencing harm, loss, or disadvantage. And the main harms that the FCA calls out in the guidance paper are financial exclusion, difficulty accessing services because of the impact of vulnerability. So that could be, for example, being unable to just get into a financial service provider's offices. Or it could be that somebody has low digital capability, which affects their ability to access online services. And clients may withdraw from contact with financial services, and by working more effectively with them, we can prevent this, which is essential, because if they do disengage from us, then they're potentially exposing themselves to much higher levels of risk. They could become unable to manage their products and services, meaning that it's important to ensure that clients understand the solutions that are being recommended to them and understand where those solutions require ongoing review. Over-indebtedness is more common in clients with characteristics of vulnerability, and in particular can be linked to mental health conditions or addiction. People may purchase inappropriate products or be exposed to mis-selling. And finally, clients may be exposed to scams or financial abuse. And there's a stereotypical view, I think, that older people are more susceptible to scams. And whilst it is true that they are at risk, research in the United States actually found that over 2/3 of financial scam victims were under the age of 45. So this is definitely one to look out for across all clients. So as I've said, when we understand the impact of vulnerability, the associated needs for that client, and can respond to those, then the risk of all of these harms is minimised. So I wanted to consider 4 customer case studies. So first of all, we have Amir, and in the last few months, he's been made redundant and has lost his father. So as a consequence of that, he's experiencing a considerable amount of stress and anxiety. So somebody in Amir's situation may well be vulnerable, and if we link it back to those FCA characteristics, then we can see the causes of this vulnerability would be life events and health. So in these case studies, I've summarised the types of things our clients may be vulnerable to. And in Amir's case, this could be financial difficulty as he tries to manage his outgoings without having a regular income. And in turn, this could lead to him taking on debt or being taken in by a scam. And of course, it's likely that he'll be experiencing emotional upset. So the type of support that could be offered to a client like Amir could include helping him with some support to rebudget, giving him information on how to contact lenders to discuss this situation and establish options to ease any cash flow issues. And if Amir is having difficulty dealing with letters, for example, then switching to telephone or email to communicate with him might be more appropriate. And then finally, Amir could be signposted toward external help like Turn to Us or the money advice service Budget Planner and Money Navigator. Now, Alice is an older lady who has been widowed after 60 years of marriage, and Alice's husband always did everything in terms of looking after their finances, so she's got very little experience of doing this. So the causes of her vulnerability are life events and low financial capability, and she's likely to be vulnerable to emotional upset and difficulty with understanding and decision-making, and of course, susceptible to scams. So to support Alice, her advisor could recommend that Alice's daughter comes along to meetings, and that supports with communication and decision-making. They could offer additional support to help Alice understand information. So, for example, have an administrator or a paraplanner actually talk Alice through the suitability reports or the investment statements that she's going to be seeing. And, of course, they allow Alice plenty of time both during and between meetings to reflect on the information that's being discussed and give her time to make decisions that she's comfortable with. Amy is a young, highly successful small business owner who has dyslexia, and she's vulnerable to having difficulty understanding information, which in turn could lead to disengagement from financial services and or exposure to mis-selling or financial abuse. So to support Amy, her advisor always provides documents in advance of meetings so that she's not expected to be taking on information on the spot. They book in longer appointments, which gives sufficient time if Amy needs to digest any information or complete any paperwork. And they ask their paraplanner to use the British Dyslexia Organisation's dyslexia-friendly style guide so that they can make their reports as accessible as possible for Amy. And that particular guide highlights the most readable fonts, the best type of report structures, and the best colours to use to help those with dyslexia. And then our final case study looks at John, who unfortunately had a stroke at the age of 54, which has left him with reduced mobility and aphasia, and that means he has difficulty speaking and following conversations. So he's vulnerable to having real difficulty accessing financial services, understanding information, and making or communicating his decisions, which ultimately could lead him to disengage. And of course, there's a real risk to John if he's unable to continue to take advice. So the support offered here is for John's partner to be in attendance at all meetings, which now take place at John's home. And between them, they've worked out a system of using pen and paper in order for John to be party to the conversation and his partner to support with that communication. They're also in the process of setting up power of attorney so that if John chooses, then his partner can make decisions on his behalf. And then finally, given his situation, John's entire financial plan is undergoing a thorough review, as it's highly unlikely that he's going to be able to return to work. So for me, the logical approach to working out how you support a client in a vulnerable situation starts with a consideration of what they're vulnerable to and then establishing how you can best work with them. But how do you gather sufficient information about your clients once you've identified a characteristic or a sign of vulnerability? And how do you pinpoint those particular support needs? Now, there are many tools that can form part of your process for working with vulnerable clients and support those conversations you have with them. So today I want to look at two of these, and we're starting with the Texas Drill, which was actually developed by the Money Advice Trust in conjunction with the Royal College of Psychiatrists. And the T in Texas stands for thanks. You know, it might have been difficult for your client to disclose something. And of course, you can also let them know that having done that will help you offer a more flexible way of working together. Then you should explain how you're going to use the information and who is anybody you're going to share it with, and of course if you're going to make a record of it, which of course means that you need to obtain your customer's explicit consent to use the information in that way. So I should point out at this stage that these protocols were developed with data protection in mind. So if you follow them as described, then you should meet your obligations. But of course, you need to satisfy yourself about that. And there's some really good information about data protection and GDPR in Appendix 1 of the FCA guidance paper. There's also an excellent guide that you can download from the Money Advice Trust, which is titled Vulnerability, GDPR and Disclosure. And in fact, that's linked in paragraph 6 of Appendix 1 of Guidance Consultation 21.1. We then move on, I think, to get to the heart of understanding your client's situation better and working out how you can support them. And you can do that by asking 3 questions. First of all, what does your situation now make it difficult for you to do? The second question is, does your situation affect your ability to deal or communicate with us? And if so, how? And the third question is, does anybody now help you manage your finances, such as a carer, a relative, or an attorney? And of course, it's important for you to know if there's a formal power of attorney that does need to be used. And if that's the case, then is it registered? Is it ready to go? Or if there isn't one, is it now time to put this in place? And then the S in Texas is for signposting. And as we saw in our case studies, this can either be toward internal or external expertise. And in other words, somebody else who may be well placed to support your client. Now, Texas is a great framework for initial conversations, but there may be times when you want to go deeper and ask even more questions to find out key information about a situation. And here's that's where the idea drill can be used. And this tool asks additional and specific questions about what your client's experiencing and the impact it's having on them. And it can be particularly useful where a customer has mental health issues, because it enables you to get valuable insight into the severity of the condition, the consequences of it, but also the duration of what's been going on and whether it's temporary, permanent or episodic. And of course, what care, support or treatment your client's been able to get for their condition. And you can, if you wish, introduce IDEA into the A of Texas, so you just expand out the question set. And IDEA, as Texas can be adapted across a range of vulnerabilities. It doesn't have to just be used for mental health. So by using these tools, you can fully understand your client's situation, get a view of the impact it has on them, and work out how you best support them. Now, you may well have got there without using these specific tools. You know, as part of the roles that many of you do, you become skilled communicators. However, I do think that these tools bring a consistent approach that everybody within a firm can take. So if you're not already using these or if you've never looked at them, it's definitely worth considering. And they also support, of course, how you record accurate and relevant information to meet your requirements under GDPR. So the FCA has said that they are keen that we look at how we communicate with vulnerable customers. And so I just wanted to share some quick thoughts with this, because some people who are vulnerable, as we've seen, may have specific challenges here. So 3 things to think about. And the first one is whether your client has additional or different needs. For example, do they need larger font than you'd normally use? Do you need to consider translation services if there's significant need or demand for this across your client base? Do you offer audio options for clients who prefer or need to listen to rather than read information? Have you thought about your client's preferences for how you communicate? So, you know, if they do dislike using the phone because they find it stressful, then, you know, have you taken that into consideration and made a record of it in terms of the client's support needs? And, of course, if they've got low digital capability, like Alice, for example, then how useful is it to give people like Alice a login to a client portal or platform without any additional support? Do you give clients extra time in meetings or between meetings so that they can think about the information you've shared or think about any additional questions that they've got? Or are there times of day that are better for clients to engage with you, you know, times when they feel at their best? And finally, we do, of course, need to ensure that all of our communications are understandable for clients. So the challenge here is, when was the last time that you reviewed the language you use in your key letters, documents, and reports? And there are lots of ways to sense check written communications, you know, through some of the tools on Microsoft Office, for example. And of course, you could, if you wish, download some of the excellent guides from the Plain English Society to help you assess how clear and easy to understand your documents are. And there are lots of simple steps you can take to adjust to the delivery and format of information. You know, it's often said that using graphics, infographics, charts, cash flow models, for example, can simplify complex information. And then for suitability reports, most people find it useful if there's a one-page summary at the front of any hefty report or information pack that they receive. And you could just title that page, Read Me First, and use it to highlight the important points, actions and deadlines, and particularly any actions or deadlines that are relevant for your client, because they see these up front rather than having to dig through a big pack before they realise that they're supposed to have done something. So the FCA guidance says that firms should offer practical and emotional support to those who are dealing with vulnerable customers. So I just want to share 2 models that can help with this. And this starts with thinking about what to do when you find yourself in a difficult situation with a client. And first and foremost, you know, staying calm, I think, is paramount. And sometimes, you know, the things that a client's discussing with you can bring up negative thoughts in your mind. So it's useful to refocus on the client and what they've just told you. And, you know, acknowledge that, thank them for sharing it, and then ask them to tell you a little bit more about how it's affecting them. Keep your breathing regular and reassure your client that they're not under any time pressure or indeed any other pressure. Repeat and play back what they've said to you if necessary, and then pause and allow them to carry on. And explaining to them that having the discussion might actually enable you to help them, I think, is quite important. And if they're distressed, you can ask direct questions like, what specifically can I do to help you? And, of course, seek advice and support for yourself, because not all conversations will be easy. And there's some ideas here that you or a colleague might think about trying if you become overwhelmed or anxious, having worked with a customer who's had some difficult challenges. So if you'd benefit from taking a break, then, do that. Take a deep breath and refocus on what the customer, colleague, or other person has told you. And you can use positive self-talk to counteract initial triggers. So, initially there may be a tendency to dwell on negative things, but just think about, how you're going to feel about this situation in 12 months' time. What would you say to a friend about it if you were counselling them? And try to take a positive approach to what you just experienced. And also, you have to take a reality check, and I think step outside of any initial emotional reaction, and that can place a more helpful perspective on the problem. So you can reframe it. Is there any other way of looking at this situation? You can combat any tendency to worry excessively about a situation by being realistic and, not, I guess, assuming that the worst will always happen. And then you can try to see the situation in a more positive light, maybe ask yourself what you've actually gained from that experience. So a change of scenery or a change of task can be helpful, and they say that it's helpful to balance exciting and calming activities. It's that variety of what we do that's important for our mental well-being and, of course, to combat any situations of stress that we're facing. And then finally, getting feelings out in the open can help you to stop dwelling on them, worrying about them, and trying to suppress them. And, we can use humour to drive away negativity, obviously appropriate humour. And most of all, you could think about how you'd counsel somebody else in your situation and then take your own advice and think about seeking external support if you need to. So I'm going to bring things to a close by just touching on some of the ways in which Scottish Widows supports vulnerable customers and drives thinking across financial services. So we have partnerships in place with Macmillan Cancer Support and with a charity called Turn to Us, who help customers in financial need get information and gain access to welfare benefits and other financial help. And if you're familiar with Scottish Widows Protection Solutions, then you may already know about our link with Red Arc. And they have a team of personal nurse advisors who give people practical advice and emotional support that can actually transform their experience of illness, disability, trauma, or bereavement. And this is available to all of our protection customers. They don't have to be making a claim on the policy to access this service. As you'd expect, we've got specialist teams in place to properly support our mutual clients at the time when they need additional help. And if I just use protection again as an example, everybody who claims on our policies has a dedicated claims assessor who stays with them throughout the entire process. And we also support and deliver a wide range of initiatives across financial services. And I mention these because we often develop a range of collateral that you can consider using with your clients. So if you receive our regular communications, then we will keep you updated on all of these initiatives. And on top of this, we've developed a range of training support for firms, in terms of helping you develop your centralised retirement propositions, your approach to vulnerable clients, communicating with clients who are experiencing poor mental health, and on the topic of empathy. When it comes to meeting client needs, then we've worked hard to embed consideration of vulnerability into our product and service design. So we have a comprehensive protection offering, and we've already talked about that Red Arc support that I mentioned. And for new customers, we've recently added our Clinic in a Pocket service, which gives them access, 24/7 access to GP appointments within an average wait time of 4 hours. And, our research is showing that a quarter of UK adults haven't booked or have delayed necessary health appointments because they didn't want to add pressure on the NHS during the pandemic. So, it's really important that people do look after themselves. So when it comes to retirement planning and retirement income, again, we're extremely well placed to help you support your clients, whether they're looking for flexibility, certainty, or indeed a mix of both. So our retirement account has a very clear charging structure, the benefit of family pricing, and a range of funds to help with all risk profiles and volatile markets. And then where your clients want simplicity, guarantees for some or all of their retirement income, then our annuities give them exactly that, and they provide valuable peace of mind. So I shared thoughts today to help you consider how you enhance the support that you offer to those who find themselves vulnerable. And that will ensure that they get as good an experience and outcomes as all of your other clients, which in turn, of course, minimises risk within your business. So please do let us know if there's anything further that we can support you with. So I'd like to thank you for your time today and hand back to Alexis to host your questions.
Hi, Jan. Thank you so much for that. Really, really appreciated and always informative. So I've got a few questions that have come in from the audience today. So I'll just push on with them. With regards to retirement as a life event, how does this apply to clients who are in the process of retiring, already in retirement, or both?
Okay, so I think for clients who are in the process of retirement, I think as a life event, this is probably going to be throwing up some psychological challenges, I guess. So they may be dealing with the fact that, sometimes they struggle to think, well, what's my purpose going to be? What am I going to do with myself? And quite often people find that immediate period post-retirement really challenging, because all of a sudden the routine that they were in for, perhaps many, many years has gone. So there's a psychological aspect to it, and there's also a financial aspect, as in, they're going from a salary to using their resources that they've accumulated to support them in retirement. So there's the financial consideration of how do you work out that plan, within their risk profile to ensure that they have capacity for loss if anything happens, and build a robust plan that client is comfortable with. For those who are in retirement, then I think then what you would be looking out for would be any signs of any of the vulnerabilities that are on the earlier slides. So is anything changing in relation to their health, their cognition, and what impact does that have both on the way that you work with them and, of course, the income solutions that they use? Their approach to risk may change quite considerably as they go through retirement. So the review process, I think, is essential in being able to identify, not just the normal things that we look at when we do reviews, like, how have the investments performed, what changes in their income needs have they got, but also use the vulnerability lens, I guess, to assess whether there's anything else going on that would alter the way you engage with that client or the recommendations that you make to them.
Thank you, Jan. Now guidance has been issued, what are the FCA's plans for monitoring how firms are responding? Okay, so they've said that firms should expect them to be asking you now to demonstrate the actions that you've taken in the key areas that we looked at right at the start of the presentation. So to understand vulnerability, to develop capability to deal with it, to recognise and respond to the needs of vulnerable clients, and to monitor and assess whether you're actually meeting those needs. So in other words, they'll be asking you, what are you doing to ensure that you're taking the additional care with vulnerable customers that we expect to see? And they probably will also want you to demonstrate that the outcomes are the same for both those who are vulnerable and not vulnerable. So you probably will need to think about the ways in which you're going to demonstrate that. Do you need to start thinking about MI that you capture, how you record vulnerability within your sort of client files or client management systems?
So what they've said is they'll be using their guidance to support them, and they'll essentially apply that vulnerability lens to supervising and enforcing the standards that their principles and rules set. They did also go on to say that they're going to be using the next couple of years to evaluate the progress that's being made, and then in 2024 they'll revisit this topic to see whether they think further improvement is needed.
Okay, and then just as a follow-up question, and Jan, I promise this will be the last one, and we'll answer all the other questions as part of the recording. What sort of information on vulnerable clients will the FCA be looking for, and from when will this start? We record notes and files if client agrees, and agree adaptations with them already.
Well, the person who asked the question is already recording notes on files and agreeing that, support needs. Yes, I mean, and that's a fantastic start. So I think, that's fundamental. That's definitely, I think, the sort of thing that the FCA, you can talk to the FCA about. This is how we are trying to ensure that the outcomes are the same for these clients. It might be worth just thinking about management information as well. So what are the kinds of things that you could do? So thinking about things like, depending on the types of solutions that your clients have, persistency information, client retention, the solutions that they're using and whether there are any marked differences for the solutions that the vulnerable customers tend to be recommended compared to everybody else. And if there is, is there good reason for that, or do you need to revisit what's happening? You could talk about whether you refer customers to any specialist support, so that signposting that we've talked about. They would probably want to see, you could look at T&C records to see how that capability development has been going. And of course, you can gather customer feedback. There's nothing better, I think, than speaking to people with lived experience of these vulnerabilities and asking them, how it's going, what improvements might they suggest. Yeah.
And can that be verbal, or does it need to be written, Jan, from the client to the advisor?
What, the feedback?
Feedback, the vulnerable piece. So if a client says they're vulnerable, or can it be verbal, or do they need to have it in writing?
No, that can be verbal. And there's an important point here, which is, I think what the regulator says in the guidance is that customers might not want a vulnerable label applied to them. And sometimes that might be, distressing or, insulting. So they actually suggest that you don't use that terminology in your interactions with clients, but rather you focus on the sorts of harm or disadvantage they may be exposed to, and then work out, how you can respond to it. So for example, what you can record is that, in the meeting on whatever day, customer disclosed the following changes in circumstantial situations, and we agreed the support needs as, and explicit consent was given. So that's, and that's all recorded then on the client file. But then when it comes to maybe the suitability report, then you might want to say something like, we've taken into account your recent bereavement and therefore we have agreed that. And then you could maybe just summarise the support that has been offered to the client. But you don't have to use the word vulnerable in any of that. But yes, it can be verbal, but it might be good practice to follow things up in writing if you think that's appropriate.
Perfect. And Jan, sorry, I'm going to squeeze another one in. So the advisor records the information about the vulnerable client and they pass it on to providers. How do they know that the providers are doing everything to address the client's vulnerability?
Okay. So is this relating to third-party providers like Scottish Widows?
So one of the advisors tells Scottish Widows that their client's vulnerable. How can they trust us to acknowledge their client's vulnerability? And for other providers too. Okay.
So I think this kind of, this I think is generally only done on a transactional basis. So if you tell us a client's vulnerable, we can't record that permanently on our record of your client, because of consent and so on. But what we can do is ensure that, so if there's a transaction about to happen, like, I don't know, your client wants to withdraw some funds from our retirement account, they're in a vulnerable situation, everything has to be done quickly or with a specific communication need, then if you tell us that, then we will just deal with that, within our service teams. They are geared up to be aware of that vulnerability and respond to it. So I guess, how do you know we're doing that? It's transactionally based rather than, a permanent thing, if that makes sense. You'd have to remind us of that if the client then comes forward with some other need or transaction.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jan. That's all the questions. We have got some questions about links and items that you've mentioned within the presentation that people want more information on, so we can try and get that out as much as possible in the Q&As. If not, clearly when people are filling in their feedback survey, if you want any more information from us or links or specific items, please call that out in your feedback and we will send them directly to you. I just want to finish up by saying, Jan, thank you so much for leading us through this presentation this morning. I want to thank our audience for attending today. As I mentioned at the start, the recording will be emailed out to you with a number of links to request a certificate of attendance, and that will come tomorrow. We'll put together a Q&A document and get as many of the questions answered as possible, but do get in touch with your relationship team if you've got any specific questions. As we close this webinar, a feedback survey will appear on your screen. It shouldn't take you any longer than 1 minute, and we would really appreciate you completing it because it helps us plan future editions of the Expert Series. So it'd be really appreciated if you could do that. Thank you so much for today, and we look forward to speaking to you all again soon. Thank you and goodbye.